The iPhone 13 and 13 mini originally came out in 2021 alongside the iPhone 13 Pro and 13 Pro Max. In the years following, we've seen many changes to Apple's lineup, eventually resulting in what we have today, which no longer includes the 13 mini, but still has the iPhone 13 as the mid-tier option in 2024 at $600 US. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and today we're talking about the iPhone 13 as well as the 13 mini. These are phones I've always heavily recommended, and in 2024, I don't really see that changing. The 13 has always represented significantly better value than the next tier up, the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus, phones that practically change nothing except bringing the 13 Pro chipset rather than the very slightly less powerful A15 in the 13 and 13 mini. There's also a little more RAM, but it really was barely an upgrade. Saving $100 and opting for the 13 makes a lot of sense in my opinion, albeit if you want the 13 mini, it's no longer being sold by Apple brand new, and so is going to require some more searching, probably on the used market, in order to find one. So the question on the table, is the 13 worth it? I would say yeah. Is the 13 mini worth it? It depends on the deal you find, but probably yeah. I'm going to be talking about both phones in this video, and if you're curious about the death of the mini iPhone, I did do a video on that a little while back, so I'll link that in the description below. But when I talk about the 13, most things I say will apply to both models. While the 13 mini is smaller, they're otherwise basically the same phone. And we will be looking at the used market later on in the video, which is of course where you'll find the mini. Made up of a glossy glass and aluminum frame like Apple's typical lower-tier options, the iPhone 13 presents a premium, beautiful design that, whilst not as expensive feeling as the stainless steel or even titanium of Apple's Pro models, still very much manages to stand out as a classy, timeless design and aesthetic. The phone feels great in the hand regardless of whichever size option you choose, the iPhone 13 mini with its 5.4-inch OLED screen measured diagonally, or the regular 13 that Apple still sells at 6.1 inches. That 13 mini is very small, a similar size, just with a larger display than like an iPhone 5S or SE, if you remember that old design, whereas the iPhone 13 is basically normal size at this point, being 6.1 inches, the standard size for Apple's base tier phones. The resolution and pixel density is high on both these phones and present a sharp, vivid, gorgeous picture, one not far removed from even the newest Pro models, albeit we do only have 60 Hz, meaning no Pro motion. Basically, this amounts to 60 frames per second rather than 120, but even the non-Pro iPhone 15 and 15 Plus are still at 60 Hz, making the 13 definitely not feel out of date in regards to Apple's own lineup at least. These screens are fantastic and complemented by the reduced notch size as seen across the iPhone 13 line. The 12 and lower had wider notches, and the smaller one really does help the phone feel more modern, especially on the 13 mini, where the notch inevitably takes up a greater percentage of the total screen space. Of course, the notch contains the tech for Face ID, which is fantastic, fast, secure, and if not the best biometrics available at the moment, still very close to it. The bezels here are also quite small, and the 13 as a whole is a very modern feeling smartphone, 3 years old or not. The design is really not so dissimilar to the newer 14 or 15. Things just don't change anymore for smartphones like they used to year to year. We've got a number of colors: red, white, blue, pink, and green. There's lots of choice. I have the white, or technically I believe it's called Starlight, but they all look great in my opinion, and the variety here is always nice to have. The glossy glass is different from the matte finish on the Pro model, not necessarily worse, just intentionally less premium feeling. You'll also naturally notice only 2 camera lenses on the back rather than 3. Specifically, we've got the ultra-wide and main camera, which we'll take a look at in a bit here. But first, let's finish off the main hardware. We do have a Lightning port rather than USB-C, something that was only just added to the 2023 iPhone 15 and 15 Pro, so there's no surprise there. We do also have MagSafe wireless charging here, which is always a nice feature. Along with this, we get the typical IP68 water and dust resistance, which should ensure protection from dropping your phone in the toilet or other similar and probably less gross situations. The battery in the iPhone 13 mini is notably smaller than the larger 13, at 2,438 mAh versus 3,240. The exact numbers don't really matter, as both phones are capable of providing a full day of usage, albeit this will vary depending on what you're doing, and the larger 13 will generally provide better life, as like with most bigger phones, you do get that bigger battery. Now, these phones are approaching that 3-year-old mark, so longtime users or buyers of pre-owned iPhones may start to notice degraded battery life, and potentially decreased performance as a result. You can check your battery health under Settings, Battery, and Battery Health. It'll let you know if your battery is still at optimal capacity, with around 80% generally being the point you'll want to look for a replacement. Apple does do this for a fee, and it could very much be worth it in order to breathe new life into your phone. In the case of a healthy battery, or at least one that's good enough, I would expect a day of life out of moderate usage, although you might want to keep a portable battery bank nearby just to be on the safe side, especially with that 13 mini. The phone is a good bit better for battery life than the 12 mini though, and in my opinion, it's pretty impressive given the size. It is really just a pity that Apple's given up on these mini iPhones, as they do have such a niche appeal, but really represent likely the best small smartphones ever made. That's actually worth emphasizing. Again, I've done a video on this already, but in short, the 13 mini is the final mini iPhone, and as a result, possibly the greatest small smartphone you'll ever be able to buy, with it still being a solid performer and having the prospect of at least a few more years of iOS updates. It's not just the best option for those wanting a small smartphone, but potentially the only genuinely great option in 2024 and even beyond. It's also worth noting that the iPhone 13 and 13 mini come with a minimum of 128 gigs, with 256 and 512 being also available for some extra cash. We'll get to pricing and everything, but first let's consider that performance. We're looking at the A15 Bionic chipset, technically with less GPU cores than the 13 Pro and iPhone 14, but Apple claimed only 30% better performance for graphics on the latter, which is going to be pretty negligible in the vast majority of use cases. While the iPhone 14 could end up getting an extra year of software support, the reality is the iPhone 13 and 13 mini are practically just as capable and powerful, although we are only looking at 4 GB of RAM as opposed to 6 gigs on the 14 and 14 Plus. This might sound like a big difference, and it's not nothing. The 14, for example, should be better with keeping apps open in the background, but iOS as a whole is incredible with memory management, as Apple's able to tailor it to their own hardware, making the 13 and 13 mini still very much strong performers, something I wouldn't expect to change anytime soon. The 13 is, at least for the most part, every bit as capable as the 15 Pro. You can run basically any app and do most anything, just like on the $1,000 plus options. Apple is also great with supporting their devices for the long haul, with iPhones currently set on a pattern of receiving at least 6 major iOS updates. And since the iPhone 13 started with iOS 15, that should bring it to iOS 21, which, considering iOS 17 came 2023, shouldn't hit until around 2027. Even then, who knows just how long these phones will actually get. By that point, I'd imagine the lower amount of RAM could be the major factor holding it back, but again, Apple's always been fantastic with memory management. And in any case, it's a safe bet to presume there'll be a good few more years of iOS support, and even past that, you're still looking at least a couple more years of most apps being fully updatable and usable. When it comes to software updates, Apple's iPhones are objectively the king, and it all makes for the iPhone 13 to still be a very appealing option, especially considering it's right at the mid-range of typical smartphone pricing. Alright, we've covered a lot of the major factors for the 13 and 13 mini: design, hardware, performance, and the future of iOS support. Next up is the cameras. The nice thing about these modern smartphones, even though they're a few years old already, is that the cameras still hold up really darn well, and that absolutely applies to these. There's those two lenses, one wide lens at 12 megapixels, and then an ultra wide at 12 megapixels as well, giving 0.5x zoom. Sure, comparing a photo from the 13 to the 48 megapixels of the 15 Pro does show a solid distinction, with particular improved detail when zooming in on the nitty-gritty of the photos, as well as when it comes to night mode and lower light pictures as a whole. The 13 and 13 mini can still absolutely take a great shot, especially in solid lighting conditions, but I mean, of course the Pro models, and the newer ones especially, are going to be better. You do miss out on the telephoto lens here, so yeah, it's not quite as versatile, but it's not the biggest loss. The ultra wide and wide still offer some good variety, and while the ultra wide doesn't always provide the greatest results in any lower light situation especially, the main lens is pretty darn good, with a mix of portrait modes and naturally up to 4K video and 60 frames per second, as well as everything else Apple offers. It's really difficult to complain about the iPhone 13's camera. Yeah, it's not the best, and it never has been, but I personally believe tech reviewers in recent years have gotten far too caught up in the minor intricacies that don't so much matter in typical day-to-day usage when it comes to smartphone photography. The 13 and 13 mini not only can take absolutely terrific photos in the right conditions, but most importantly can capture the moments and memories that you want to remember forever. Yes, the 15 Pro is going to be better, but the 13 is still more than solid, and I wouldn't be too concerned about the cameras on these phones. It's also worth mentioning the 14 and 14 Plus did basically nothing to upgrade the cameras, so if you do want to get a better camera than this, you're looking at the iPhone 15 line, and ideally the 15 Pro with its 3 lenses. But then you're going from $600 to $1,000, which is the exact slippery slope that Apple hopes you'll get caught up in to end up spending more money. Look, I like Apple, but they're getting more than enough money day to day. If you'd rather not give them your cash, or just want to save some money in general, it might just be worth looking at the used market. Now naturally, the iPhone 13 being one of the lowest iPhone tiers will see some discounts and deals throughout the year from retailers and carriers, so that is worth looking out for. But it's online marketplaces like eBay.com or Craigslist and so on that you're going to find the real deals if you're willing to do some digging. And even before that, there is Apple's own refurbished section, which you can find on their website at the bottom under the Apple Store header there, certified refurbished. At the time of recording this, Apple's US website is only offering a couple iPhone 12 models, but this does change frequently and might be worth checking if you're interested. Apple refurbished products are generally as good as brand new, new, so it's a pretty awesome way to save some cash and still get that brand new feeling Apple experience. All this does vary country to country, by the way, for selection, so it's worth checking either way. But the used market. It's difficult to gauge the average prices in most places around the world, and outside of the US, iPhones can get really, really expensive. I myself am in Canada, but for the sake of using some sort of universal metric, let's look at eBay.com and US dollars. These phones vary in price quite wildly. The iPhone 13 mini I was finding for under $300, which isn't too bad. Of course, a lot of listings were more than that. The iPhone 13 tended to be about $50 to $100 extra, which is about reasonable for the larger size options. So what you want to do is really up to you. If you can find like an iPhone 13 for $300, that's a heck of a deal and half the price of buying it straight from Apple new. Of course, eBay's really about the luck of the draw. If you are going to buy there, make sure you're getting it from a good seller, but you might want to look at something more local, like Facebook Marketplace, Craigslist, that sort of thing, in order to potentially find an even better deal. The 13 mini in particular is so unique that even if it's not the most spectacular deal in the world, I still recommend these phones because I think they're worth it. And you could always look at going to a carrier, getting a contract, potentially getting a deal that way. The 13 being the lower tier iPhone that Apple's selling right now aside from the SE means it's going to see a lot of sales. So that might be a good way to get your hands on one with like a 2-year contract. You have options, it really depends on your own situation, but overall, these phones in general are great. Whichever way you shake it, I don't think you can go wrong choosing the iPhone 13 in 2024 if that's the phone you're looking at buying. And if you've got one, I don't think you need to upgrade for probably another couple years unless you really want to. It's a solid performer, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. And so with that, I think we're right about done here. Hopefully this helped you out, and if it did, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more tech content. Definitely would love to hear from those of you that own the 13 or 13 mini, or maybe are considering getting one. How's the phone holding up for you? Do you think it's worth it in 2024? Make sure you leave your comments down below. With that all being said, thank you so much for watching. I am Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.